Hi, my name is Scott the Miniature Maniac, and today we're printing up some crispy 3D models. What up, Mini family? Let me spin you a tale. I wanted to print some miniatures on my Resin 3D printer, so I followed the advice in my last 3D printing video, which was chock full of conventional 3D printing wisdom. It worked last time, so it can't fail this time, right? I leaned the Mini back 45 degrees, I placed some auto supports, sliced the miniature following some settings provided by someone else, and hit print, and it didn't look so good. So I tried it again, but with a different slicer, and again with a different resin, but I kept getting garbage results. At this point, I was getting fed up. People can get amazing results with consumer resin 3D printers, so why am I struggling so much? Let me tell you why. There are two major factors in 3D printing that will affect your printing fidelity. The first one is your exposure settings. Each layer of your miniature is exposed to UV light, partially curing it. If you expose it for too long or too little, you stand to lose detail. The next important factor when considering high quality resin prints is supports. Where you place them, how you orient your model on the build plate are all things that will drastically affect the end result of your resin print. Okay, of course there are other things that will affect your resin print quality. One being how warm your room is, another being what kind of resin you're using, and finally how taut and clean your FEP in your vat is. But to me, the big question marks are exposure settings and also supports. So how do we take that from being a question mark to being something quantifiable that we can nail every single time? Let's start with exposure settings. The Anycubic Photon S with firmware version 3.4.1 installed has a cool feature called the Resin Exposure Rangefinder. If you run a print of a certain file extension, it will break your build plate into 8 different zones and expose each zone for different times. This means if you have a consistent design in each zone, you can compare them and find out which one has the best detail given the resin you're using and the environment you're printing. This is a lot faster than printing the same mini 8 different times with varying exposure times. If you have the old Photon, this test is available to you as well. You just have to run it in a different way. I'll have all the details about that in the description of this video. So now with these little cards I got in Thingiverse, I can do some analysis and figure out my perfect exposure times. Okay, but what if you don't have an Anycubic printer? Well then you have to resort to the numbers that other people have figured out and then modify them from there based on the results you're seeing. Resin is fairly cheap, so try printing the same model with the same support 3 different times, increasing or decreasing your exposure by 1 second and comparing your results to find out what works best for you. Basically, you want as little exposure as needed before you start getting printing failures. Okay, that's the exposure settings figured out. Either you have access to a nifty resin exposure rangefinder test, or you can print the same model back to back, dialing in what settings work for you. But what about supports? I'll be honest, I didn't fully understand the purpose of supports at first, but now I have a better idea. You need to support the weight of the model. The resin isn't fully cured by the machine, and because of this, there's a chance that it will droop if not supported. Also, you need supports to solve the problem of islands. No, not that kind of island, this kind of island, which is significantly less exciting. Portions of your resin 3D print will start to cure before they're attached to the main body of what already is supported, and in that event there'll just be little resin bits floating in your vat until your resin printer gets to a layer that connects the floating island to the main body of what's being printed. And by then you've already lost a piece of your mini, and it's likely going to mess with future prints having a chunk of cured resin floating around in your vat.
So what's the big deal? Just lean your model back 45 degrees, run auto supports, and it should work, right?
Wrong. Techniques like this can work, but for what I was printing, the amount of supports that were created ruined the detail of the model on the back. I want everything in my mini to look good, not just the front. Having little pits on the miniature that I have to deal with later is not fun. The best way to deal with supports at this time is to place them manually, and I can hear you groaning already, but hear me out. Learning how to place supports is nothing like learning how to paint miniatures or learning how to sculpt. In a solid afternoon of research, you can figure out how to place supports for 90% of the miniatures that you are going to encounter. It's a really low time investment compared to how much it affects your end product. So quit your whining! A good starting point is in your chosen slicing software. Angle the model back about 10 degrees and go up 1 layer at a time trying to spot the islands. There'll be little bits of model not attached to anything. Some people like to look at the bottom of the miniature and use the cursor to identify where the islands are. You can see them really easily. It's where the little black circle gets so small that it disappears. When I place my supports, I start with this method, but soon thereafter I switch to a top-down look. It's easier for me to catch super tiny islands this way. Generally, it's a good rule of thumb to avoid having a support that starts on the model and ends on the model. It's better if all the supports are attached to the build plate. It makes cleanup easier. Unless the area you are adding supports to is really easy to clean up, like the bottom of a base or the bottom of a miniature's foot, or it's a big heavy part of the model, I'd avoid needlessly adding supports. The more you add, the more you need to clean up. For me, this method typically catches 95% of all islands, and you could stop here and be happy, or you could crush 100% of all the islands systematically with the help of software. Save your supported model as a .photon file, even if you're not planning on printing on a photon like myself. This is possible in the Chi2Box slicer. Import the model into the Photon File Validator, a program I'll have linked below, and import your photon file. Step 1 is to click Fix, and then Start. There will be a large amount of incredibly small islands due to your supports being off by 1 or 2 pixels. Unfortunately, if you're not specifically printing on a Photon Resin 3D printer, this step won't really help you very much, but it isn't much of a deal breaker because these islands are so small they're not really visible. Once the super tiny islands are dealt with, you can start walking through each island, finding it in the file validator, which will tell you the layer the island occurs on. Then you can pop back into your slicer, navigate to that specific layer, and then add a support. Now we don't need to guess where all the islands are. We can have this nifty program find them all for us. I'm not gonna lie, the first time I did this, it took me nearly 2 hours to finish supporting my model. But I did it a second time and I was much faster. So there is some learning to be done, and certain models will take longer or shorter depending on how complicated they are. If you need more help with the specifics of placing supports in Chi2Box, I'll have links to videos in the description of this video that helped me a lot during my research. Okay, so we have a method to dial in our exposure and software to systematically find every single island. Our print should be flawless, right? Well, let's take a look. It looks pretty good. I accidentally printed it too large a scale. I think I was looking at the wrong dimension in my slicer when I was sizing him up. There are some elements of this miniature that are still a little soft. However, it does look great once painted up, but I want crispier detail. Let's see if I can experiment with a different resin to get a better result. I'll also print it in a more realistic scale for miniatures. A little bit of time in the oven and wow. The detail on this model is pretty incredible. The details are nice and sharp, and the model is 35mm tall. It's pretty amazing what consumer resin 3D printers can do. There is some upfront cost and research and time, but once you dial it in, you can crank out prints. I'm not gonna lie, the time investment had me intimidated at first, but now that I have enough knowledge to be dangerous, I want to run this thing 24/7, printing off models non-stop. Well, those are the best miniatures that I can get on my Resin 3D printer, but there's always room to grow. If you guys think that I missed some detail about getting high quality resin prints, leave it below in the comment section so we can all learn together. If you guys like the channel and you want to support it, there are a number of ways that you can do that, and they're all linked in the description below, namely a Patreon campaign that has rewards like a Discord server where you and I can hang out any day of the week and chat about your miniature painting projects or your favorite flavor of liquid resin. You can also find in the description all the accessories that I use for 3D printing, and they're all affiliate links, so when you purchase using those links, I get a kickback at no extra cost to you. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint more minis!